I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show. Happy Monday, everybody. Hope you had a wonderful weekend. So I am not going to be hosting the show today. I am busy and I am away. So I'm going to hand it over to a familiar face to the audience, Kris Sims from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. She's fantastic. She has got a great episode in store for you today, folks. So without further ado, over to you, Kris Sims.
Hey, thanks so much for joining us. I am Kris Sims. I'm the Alberta Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Thanks for joining us today and spending some of your time with us here on Juno. Now, some of the imagery coming out of Alberta right now is kind of sun-filled, right? We have all of these world leaders gathering with our beautiful province as their backdrop. It just makes me think of a bunch of rich men from north of Richmond gathering together and making promises that we have to pay for, that taxpayers and normal working people have to pay for. Now, let's hold out hope that people like Alberta Premier Danielle Smith can have a great meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump and work out things like getting rid of all of the tariffs, okay? Actually working out perhaps a new trade deal so we don't need to roll over and check X every morning to see, if our economy is still here in Canada. So let's hope for those sort of things to be straightened out. My hope is that U.S. President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Mark Carney actually talk about things like Carney's continued plan to ban the sale of normal gasoline and diesel-powered vehicles. Like, it's one of the craziest ideas ever, and it's going to start kicking in 6 months. So in 6 months' time, in 2026, it's going to start kicking in so that dealers must have 20% of their new car sales to be battery-powered cars. And if they can't sell them, tough cookies. They just have to sit there on the lot and pile up as inventory. And if, guess what, you want to go purchase a normal gasoline and diesel-powered new vehicle, it's going to be tough cookies for you soon, too, in Canada. Why? Because the government says so. Now, the reason why I'm hoping that Trump and Carney have a conversation about this, among many other things, is that Trump, it's one of the first things he did when he was elected. He got rid of their so-called EV mandate in the United States. And when it comes to actual market force, we know who the big gorilla is here. That's the United States. So hopefully that changes. But something else that really needs to change is the affordability. I can't help but think, while I'm watching all of these fancy world leaders and politicians, these elites from all over the planet, sitting there dining, what the tab is going to be, right? I can't help but think about people who can't afford those fancy dinners. And I gotta say, I was doing the grocery shopping for my family recently, and I was just thunderstruck again by the increased costs of things. I've got a picture here that I snapped when I was in Walmart, and this is just a normal size can of regular coffee, okay? It wasn't one of those big honkin' ones that you'd get for the camper or something from Costco. No, it's just a normal size, can of coffee. And it's $21. 21 bucks. I used to be able to get that regular price around $9 or $10. On sale, I used to get it for like $7. That was a good sale. $21 now. It's enough to choke a horse. I was in the mall the other day, just kind of window shopping, right? And I noticed just a regular kid's hoodie. I'm not talking about like a big sports hoodie or anything like that. Just a regular hoodie, plain front, was $68 or $67. With tax, it would be about $70 for a little kid's hoodie. Like, I can't understand how people can afford things right now. And the answer is they can't. Because, of course, 50%, half of Canadians now say they're within $200 every single month of not being able to pay the minimum amount on their bills. What that means in normal people talk is they're within $200 of insolvency every month. Those are working people. Those are people who've been holding down jobs their entire lives. That's why you're seeing record demand at food banks. And that hasn't changed. That hasn't changed just because the Prime Minister isn't talking about his socks. That hasn't changed just because we now have a guy with a PhD from Oxford in economics at the helm. But I hope it does. I really do hope that Prime Minister Mark Carney does the smart things. That he stops wasting money, that he balances the budget, that he gets rid of all of his plans for all of his hidden industrial carbon taxes, and that he stops printing money. Because right now, we have still got an inflation crisis. And I'm going to talk to an expert in a second to explain why inflation is still a bad thing. The next time you hear some pointy head, okay, on the media say, oh, inflation is going down or is slowing down, that doesn't mean prices are going down. That means that we have careened to this huge high in inflation suddenly, okay, over the last few years, and now it's still increasing, it's just increasing slower. So that's why you're not seeing prices drop at the stores. So what is causing this huge cost increase for normal working people in Canada? Let's find out. Joining me now is Franco Terrazzano, my good friend, and the federal director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Franco, lots of rich men from north of Richmond are busy meeting at the G7 right now. That's all well and good. I know it's going to cost taxpayers a lot of money. Whenever I see that footage, I'm just like wincing because the bill is going to be high. But I want to talk about how this affects normal people. So we're seeing Prime Minister Mark Carney actually gripping and grinning with U.S. President Donald Trump. They're in the same room. They're in the same pictures. A lot has been made about Trump's tariffs on things like steel and aluminum. But the question here in Canada is, why are we punching ourselves in the face with things like this looming industrial carbon tax? Can you explain what this industrial carbon tax is and what the problem is with it?
Yeah, for sure. And look, I know a lot of people who are watching this show, like they know that Carney is not scrapping all carbon taxes, right? They know that Carney just wants to change the carbon tax, right? So he set the consumer carbon tax rate to 0. That's the one that you pay when you fuel up at the gas station or on your heating bill. But what Carney is doing is he's shifting, relabeling, repackaging the carbon tax into what is known as a hidden industrial carbon tax, okay? So that's a tax on like oil and gas producers, fertilizer plants, steel companies, and many others. But of course, it's not just those businesses that pay the tax. It's really Canadians, both consumers and workers, who pay that tax, right? So you have a lot of the media, you have a lot of the political class all up in arms over Trump's tariffs. And okay, fair enough, but we got to control what we can control. And what the Canadian government can control is not what Trump is doing. It's how the Canadian government is taxing Canadians. And by imposing a hidden carbon tax on Canadian businesses like oil and gas, like fertilizer plants, like steel manufacturers, yes, that is going to make prices go up here in Canada. But that is going to push Canadian entrepreneurs to cut production here and then to set up shop south of the border because, oh, by the way, the White House doesn't impose carbon taxes like Ottawa is doing.
You don't need to take Franco's word for it here. Remember just a second ago during the federal election when a labor union endorsed the Conservatives? Like I said, I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience. I've been in the game a long time, and I've never seen a labor union endorse the Conservatives. And that wasn't the issue. The issue was why they were doing it. And it was the steel workers around Hamilton area who were saying that the industrial carbon tax was going to, quote, decimate their industry. And for exactly the reason you just said, on increasing the costs and making them pick up and move south.
Yeah, I mean, look, the United States doesn't have a national carbon tax, right? The White House doesn't impose a national carbon tax, and it doesn't matter who is in the White House, right? The Democrats didn't do it. The Republicans aren't doing it. So you have that extra cost that makes Canada less competitive because we are hammering our entrepreneurs with carbon taxes while the United States government isn't. Not to mention that if you look around the world, it's like 70% of countries that do not impose national carbon taxes. And then you layer that all on top of the fact that Canada is not competitive on income taxes or business taxes. And this is just another smack in the face from the Canadian government onto many of our Canadian businesses and therefore also our workers and our consumers, right? That trade organization that you mentioned there, they know that when you make Canadian businesses less competitive, well, that means fewer jobs, as our tax system is pushing our businesses to leave Canada and in some cases just increase production south of the border.
Big time. And then lastly, we haven't even touched on carbon tax tariffs. Like Carney mentioned this out loud with his face during the election campaign. And in a nutshell, what that means is Carney looks around the world And if he sees a country that doesn't have a carbon tax, that upsets him. And that upsets him so much that when we take something in from that country, when we import a widget from a country that doesn't have a national carbon tax, he's going to slap a tariff on that import for us to pay here in Canada. So this is not over. Yes, it is good that we have about 20 cents off the cost of gasoline that I can see here in Lethbridge, for example, at the pump. That's real savings and it's important. But folks, stay tuned on this because Carney is busy cooking up a big new industrial carbon tax and carbon tax import tariffs on stuff. So this part isn't over. Lastly on this, I might just be blue pilling here, hoping for the perfect day. But do you think there's a chance that Carney just wrote all that stuff in his book, Values, about things like carbon tax tariffs, industrial carbon taxes, personal carbon emissions budgets, all carbon, 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 tax, 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 tax? Is there a chance, do you think, Franco, that he wrote that because he was the UN envoy on this topic, and there's a chance that that PhD in economics will win out the day, and he'll actually be the Paul Martin type and start balancing the budget?
Oh, yeah, I don't know, man. I think that might be above my pay grade. Look, I honestly don't know. I mean, look, I wrote a book. It's called Axing the Tax, The Rise and Fall of Canada's Carbon Tax. You can get it now. There it is. But look, I wrote it because I believe what I was saying, that the carbon tax always was and always will be a scam for the ordinary Canadians who are forced to foot the bill. So I can only imagine that when Carney wrote those words in his book Values, he meant what he was saying. And look, all I can really say for sure is what the government has done so far, what Mr. Carney has said so far, right? And on carbon taxes, well, he's been very clear that he supports carbon taxes, right? He just wanted to change, his words, the carbon tax from the consumer, the one that you see, to the hidden industrial carbon tax that will mean fewer jobs for Canadians, but also higher prices, right? Because when you tax a fertilizer plant, well, that makes the cost of growing food and the cost of buying food more expensive. When you carbon tax refineries, well, that makes your gasoline and diesel more expensive. And when you carbon tax utilities, that makes your home heating bill more expensive, right? So look, look at Carney's own words. He wants to impose hidden carbon taxes. Now let's look at the debt, the spending, right? The deficits. Well, if you look at his election platform, Carney wants to add $225 billion to the debt over the next 4 years. $225 billion to the debt. That's on top of the fact that Trudeau doubled the debt in less than a decade. In fact, you look at Trudeau's last budget numbers, and he would add about $131 billion to the debt over that same time. So, do a little math, beep, boop, beep, boop. And Carney plans on adding almost $100 billion more to the debt over the next 4 years. So, Kris, you asked me, what do I think is in Carney's head? Well, I don't know, right? That's way above my pay grade to try to figure out. But what I do know is what he said and what the government is doing. And look, he's putting in a hidden carbon tax. His election platform wanted to rack up even more debt.
Brutal. Brutal. I actually still can't believe that. I remember distinctly during the election campaign when it came out that he was going to add more to the debt than Trudeau was going to. I seriously thought I was misreading it. I'm like, no, this must be a me thing. This can't be possible. The economist can't be worse with money than the drama teacher. But apparently, survey says he's gonna be. I wanted to shift slightly here because before things really got ramped up, I would even say just leading up to the lockdowns, I would say, inflation. People were talking a lot about inflation, especially during the lockdowns. Not that many people, I will point out. You were talking about it. You were warning about inflation. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, to his credit, was on national media warning about inflation. And is it ever here? Like I mentioned during the opening, I was doing grocery shopping for my family recently. A regular can of like Folgers coffee, okay, just a normal size can now, is $21. That used to be $9. A normal hoodie, like not licensed, not a sports hoodie, a normal kid's hoodie from the mall is $68. Like the costs are just astronomical. They're through the roof. Like beef is unaffordable for people now. Like people keep saying, oh, inflation is slowing down. I really wanted to do a quick deep dive with you on this because you explain it so well. Why are we in the middle of an inflation crisis right now in Canada? What happened, especially during the lockdowns? What did the government do to cause this?
Well, look, first of all, let's just cut through the spin. When you hear anyone twisting themselves into a pretzel saying that inflation is down, what that really means is this: prices rose by a 40-year high, okay? And then since then, prices aren't going down, they're still going up. They're just not going up as high as they did when they reached a 40-year high, right? So all that is to say is that life is still crazy unaffordable, right? And everyone who is outside of the political bubble, who goes to the grocery store, who, like you, Kris, go to get your son a hoodie, they know how expensive life is. So then the question is, well, why did inflation go crazy in Canada and around the world? Well, guess what? You implement silly policies, you get silly prizes, okay? Now, that's a nice way of saying what I'm thinking, but here's what happens. Okay, look, what explains a general increase in prices, so prices going up across the board, is one thing. It's the expansion of the money supply. It is the printing press going burr, right? Is a government's central bank printing new dollars out of thin air. In the case of Canada, you had the perfect storm for inflation. On the one hand, you had the government central bank, the Bank of Canada, print up during the heart of the pandemic anywhere from about $300 to $400 billion. And it did that with a stroke of a keypad, buying financial assets, largely Government of Canada debt. Okay, that is the inflation tax, when the central bank, the Bank of Canada, finances Ottawa's deficits by printing up new dollars. Okay, and the problem is this: you can't print up farmland out of thin air. You can't print up refineries out of thin air, but the government can print up new dollars out of thin air, okay? More dollars chasing fewer goods. And then here's where you get the flip side of the equation, right? Where during the pandemic, when we were going through, 3 years of revolving lockdowns, businesses, the economy wasn't producing as much as it normally would. So we weren't producing as much of the stuff that money buys. So when you had the printing press on overdrive and you had our economy locked down, you had the perfect storm for inflation, which is too many dollars chasing too few goods.
Was that a choice that the government made? Because you hear
Well,
apologists all the time. They make it sound as if a volcano went off or something. It's like, no, dude, you made that choice.
Yeah, of course it is, right? This is a decision by the government central bank, by the Bank of Canada, to finance massive government deficits, right? Inflation isn't like a natural disaster. It's not an act of God. Inflation is a deliberate policy that helps politicians who have out-of-control spending, who don't want to rein in the spending, and who, quite frankly, want to try to hide the costs, right? Because the inflation tax is also a fundamentally undemocratic tax, right? It's a way to finance deficits or finance massive spending without actually increasing tax rates, right? Everyone knows who's at fault when politicians increase income taxes or increase sales taxes, but it's very hard to find the culprit if you're just an ordinary person when the government is rising inflation stealthily through the Bank of Canada or through any other central bank.
This is a loaded question, and I don't actually know your answer to it, which is rare. I get a treat whenever I pick up Franco from the Calgary airport. I get an economics lesson, like it's awesome. So is there a way out of this? Like sorry for the layman's terms, but I hear pointy heads on TV say, "Oh, we can't have deflation. That would be a bad thing." And in my brain, I'm like, wouldn't that make prices go down? Isn't that a good thing? How do we get out of this? Is there any chance that we're going to see a normal price, what we would call normal, for kids' clothes and groceries and all of the stuff that we have to spend money on? Is there a way out of this to make prices go down?
Well, look, first of all, prices going down is not a bad thing, right? I mean, it makes your life more affordable as a consumer, but then also businesses, when you look at profits, what they really are is a margin. So if businesses' input costs are going down, that doesn't mean that they now can't succeed because prices are going down, because what they're paying to produce those goods is also lower. Right? And also too, if you shrink the money supply, the only thing that is really happening is that you're shrinking it after the government artificially increased it. Okay, remember that, folks. So to your question, what can the government do? Well, there's a few things. Number one, stop printing money. right? Like that's number one, because when you print more dollars out of thin air, too many dollars chasing too few goods means you have the inflation tax. So get the federal spending under control. Stop accumulating the massive borrowing, the tens of billions of dollars of deficits every single year. But then the flip side of the equation is like, look, we got to get our economy firing in all cylinders. We got to be able to produce the stuff that all that extra money buys, right? So, you have to get your fiscal house in order when it comes to the government of Canada, and you have to be able to create the conditions to allow job creators to come here, to get our natural resource projects built, and to actually build the stuff, grow the economy, to essentially sop up all that extra money.
I'm picturing it almost like we need fresh mop heads. Like all of the water has cascaded around the kitchen. It's everywhere. It's a flood. We need fresh mop heads and towels soaking up all of that extra cash. And those are widgets. Those are actual things that we can use. Is there a way, this is probably a stupid question, is there a way for the government to reduce the money supply? Or is there just, do we need more stuff to spend money on for the money to go? Or is there a way for them to reabsorb it?
Look, I think here's the two most likely things, right? So number one is like, if you're in a hole and you're trying to get out, the first rule is just to stop digging, right? So if you're doing something dumb, the first thing to do is stop doing that dumb thing. And when it comes to the federal government, there's a lot of dumb things going on. But like, let me just say two things that the government can do, right? First of all, just stop running up the debt. Right? Interest charges on the debt are already costing us more than $1 billion every single week, right? That's a brand new hospital that's not getting built every week because the feds are paying interest charges on the debt. So number one, you got to get the out of control borrowing, the out of control spending, right? You got to get that under control so that we're not seeing any of the printing press used to finance Ottawa's deficits. But number two, like stop throwing up roadblocks to development. Right? We don't need government in the business of business. We need government to get out of the way, right? The No More Pipelines law, the discriminatory tanker ban, the fact that the government moved the goalposts, the regulatory goalposts on the Energy East pipeline, right? Rejecting Northern Gateway. It goes on and on and on. So in addition to just getting your spending under control, the government has to just stop throwing up roadblocks, unnecessary red tape that has made it almost impossible for Canada to get large, major projects done and built here.
That's a big one. And the energy cap. We've got an energy cap.
There you go.
$20 billion hole. And that isn't our numbers. That's the parliamentary budget officer that is saying that Ottawa's cap on Alberta's energy, they call it an emissions cap, but it's really a production cap, is going to blow a $20 billion hole in the Canadian economy over the next few years and cost something like 40,000 jobs or something. It was crazy. So these are just, you'd think, seemingly simple things that the feds can do to take their foot off of our necks. Do you see this happening? Do you think that if we yell loud enough and long enough, I mean, we got the consumer carbon tax reduced down to zero. There's a chance that if we get people up on how much they're spending on the debt, $1 billion a week, folks. $1 billion. Picture a hospital. Poof, gone every single week. That's how much we're spending just on interest. Do you think there's a chance we can get people riled up enough that we can make Carney move on this?
Well, yeah, like I'm glad you brought up the example of this consumer carbon tax, because to me, that's actually an example of, David beating Goliath. Where, Goliath, you had all of the taxpayer-funded political elites, the bureaucracy, those politicians, right? You had the academics, you had many in the media who essentially were telling Canadians to sit down, be quiet, and pay your carbon tax bills, right? Look, I even remember there was an opinion piece that was published, I believe, in the Globe and Mail, and it said something to the effect after the last 2021 election, where it was like carbon tax, the fight against the carbon tax is over, carbon taxes are here to stay. Well, in a few short years, from massive pushback from Canadians, from a lot of premiers out there, Brad Wall, he did a great job fighting the carbon tax since day one. Obviously, Mr. Poilievre, like he was fighting the carbon tax harder than I've ever seen any federal politician. But because of the massive backlash, beginning with ordinary Canadians, you forced the Liberal government to back down on their own favorite tax, right? The consumer carbon tax, right? Up until about what? 6 minutes ago, they were saying how good the carbon tax was for you. And Canadians, a couple of those good politicians, they forced the Liberal government to back down on their own consumer carbon tax. Now, look, I know the fight against the carbon tax is not over, but it's just a good example that even if things look really bleak today, the political landscape can shift so quickly that if you keep applying the pressure, you can push the government to actually move in the right direction. So, yeah, folks, I mean, look, politics is a participation sport. And even if you don't care about politics, those politicians care about your wallet. So you have to get involved. You have to get off the bench.
Franco, thank you so much for your time. That is why we have a debt clock and we drive it around the country to show people how much this debt is costing them. Thank you so much for your time.
Hey, always a pleasure.
Once again, that was Franco Terrazzano, the federal director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, highlighting the fact that we are in deep trouble. We have a huge debt in this country. It is now more than $1 trillion. The Trudeau government alone doubled the national debt. That's kind of incomprehensible, but kind of do a little mental exercise and picture it. Think back all the way down our national railway, all the way back to Sir John A. Macdonald, that Prime Minister's government. Now roll yourself forward, okay? Mackenzie King and Diefenbaker and Mulrooney and the first Trudeau. Okay, picture all of those governments that were there during world wars, that were there during the Great Depression. Picture all of those debts. Double them. That's what Trudeau did. That's what Trudeau did in 9 years. I never thought as a Western Canadian kid that was raised in the 80s that I would see a worse government than the first Trudeau government. But here we are. So we have got a doubled national debt. The interest payments on the debt are costing taxpayers, you, right now, today, $1 billion a week. And the problem here is that while, yes, we're seeing more of a mature comportment coming from Prime Minister Mark Carney, he's not sillily saying things like the budget will balance itself. He's not pointing out his socks on a world stage to grown-up people. So that's an improvement. But this can't just be image-based. This has to be real. The problem is we are not hearing real change coming from Prime Minister Carney. Case in point, we don't have a budget. There should be a budget right now. And for the folks at home who are trying to give him the benefit of the doubt, saying, oh, well, he's new to the job and he just got there and how could they possibly get that done in time? Yes, I understand why you think that. But here's the thing. There's something called the permanent government in Ottawa, the bureaucracy. And yes, all of those smart kids in class in the finance department and at the treasury department, they have all these numbers. Basically what a budget is revenue in, spending out. It's all it is. It's basically two big graphs, okay? That's all they really need to do. They need to tell us how much they're taking in tax revenue and other revenues. They need to tell us what they're spending money on. That's it, including things like debt interest payments. And they're not opening up and saying, you know what, we've sobered up, the party's over, kids have gone home, now we need to balance the budget. Here's how we do it. Let's get rid of stupid ideas like the pipeline ban. Let's get rid of a stupid idea like the cap on energy. Let's get rid of a stupid idea like banning the sale of normal gasoline and diesel-powered vehicles. Because not only is that way too big of a government telling you what you can and can't drive and interfering with the market for dealerships and salespeople, but it also is going to cost us hundreds of billions of dollars that we don't have. So how are we going to fix this problem? Let's find out. Joining me now is a good friend of the program, Dan McTeague. Dan is a longtime former Liberal member of Parliament. He knows his stuff, especially when it comes to things like finance and the automotive sector, which is why we've got him here on the show as the president for Canadians for Affordable Energy. A little bit of inside baseball. Whenever I needed the second carbon tax explained to me in British Columbia, I would text poor Dan at any time of night saying, how on earth do I make sense of all these carbon credits and all this nonsense and make it make sense? Dan, thank you for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thank you, Kris.
I wanted to get into the fact that this government is very soon going to be banning the sale of what I would call normal gasoline and diesel powered vehicles. Now, it's going to be 100% ban, meaning all new vehicles must be an electric vehicle or battery powered vehicle by 2035. And for folks who say, oh, that's 10 years, that's forever. The Trudeau government was in power for 10 years. That goes by like this. So I wanted to get into this with you right off the top. When are we going to see these restrictions start coming into force at the vehicle sales lot?
Well, on the vehicle lots across the country, you're going to have 1 in 5 vehicles, not just on the lot, but Chris, 1 in 5 have to be sold. In other words, for you to sell 5 vehicles, one of the 5 has to be electric vehicle, or you simply can't sell it. You'll defy your own quota. Now, whether that's arranged at the manufacturing level or whether that's arranged at the marketing level, there's a lot of questions as to how appropriate this is, given that there isn't the take up. Right now, we've seen actually a decline in sales, especially when there's no more subsidies, or subsidies are being removed from consumers, both federal and provincial. Quebec, British Columbia, $7,000 to $12,000. Some money even for some used vehicles. Good luck with that, by the way. But at the end of the day, if you're going to increase and ratchet this up, 10% every year with mandates of 20% beginning next year on January 1st, good luck. I think the automotive sector is already starting to say it, and you see companies have been known for their grift. General Motors, hey, this is not such a great idea. We have to get rid of this. Ford, hey, we're not building an EV. We're going to take the Oakville plant, which I live very close to here. We're going to convert that back to an F-250 because we're not stupid. We're tired of losing money. My old company, Toyota, yes, I did media relations for that company, not a small company. It's the number 1 exporter of automotive products to the United States. Never really got on this stuff, didn't want part of the grift, and wasn't going to go along with the happy-go-lucky crowd who basically thought we could subsidize and blast our way into selling vehicles that no one wants. And now with the United States firmly walking away from electric vehicle mandates, basically in one fell swoop. Trump had said he was going to do it during the election. He recommitted to it after he was elected, and he made it good the other day with the EPA regulations, the waiver so-called. In one fell swoop, there is no more market for electric vehicles in the United States, and therefore no market for Ontario's manufacturing sector when it comes to EVs. I hope Doug Ford is listening.
I hope he is too, frankly, after what we saw during the last election and the fact that he was failing to hold Mark Carney to account on his industrial carbon tax plan. I thought I was having an out-of-body experience, Dan, seeing some of those steel workers endorse the Conservatives, like a labor union endorsing the Conservatives. Why? Because they said that Carney's industrial carbon tax was going to decimate their steel industry, and the Premier of Ontario saying absolutely nothing about it. That was wild. So I sure hope that Premier Ford's listening to this conversation and to this issue. Now, was that a game changer when Trump came out and said, you know what, this is off the table. We're not doing this anymore. I mean, they've just got such a huge market force there.
Big time. And for 4 years, it's gone. I mean, that means that anything that we decided to do based on Biden's, Inflation Reduction Act, spending, up to $1 trillion of money they don't have to borrow when they're at $38 trillion in the hole, just didn't make any sense. And we knew it was going to end. A lot of people recognized this is just not going to happen. And at a practical level, people are buying them because they're getting $5,000-$7,000. But now when you take that away, that move into the market of 10% is now dropped back to 8-7%. Car dealers across the country, go talk to them. They can't sell these things fast enough, and they give massive discounts. No one wants them. There are real concerns. They're very costly. They're very hard to maintain. They're not as efficient as an internal combustion engine, and they sure as hell aren't well suited for Canadian cold climate. And I say that because anybody who takes his little iPhones out of their smartphone, leave it out in the wind in the cold for about 3 hours and see how much battery power you have left. So look, the idea is nice. It's novel. It's great. But if you want an over-glorified scooter, then to go around the city, take public transit or buy an e-bike. But trying to force me and a lot of other people to pay for this at a time in which it's pretty clear no one wants these things. Battery companies are going bankrupt. Major automotive companies are smelling the coffee and realizing they're going to lose too much money. It's time to back off on this. If not, if you really want these things, take the damn sanctions off China. Let them bring in their BYDs and their Jillies. They're a lot cheaper. If that's what you really want to drive around in, you don't have any concern about elbows up when it comes to China, then why would you punish Western Canadian canola farmers with significant and silly tariffs on protecting an industry that shouldn't survive unless it can stand on its own 2 feet?
That China element is a great point. I really wanted to stress this on, so for the practical person who, imagine you're going to a car lot and you want to buy a new vehicle, what is this going to do on the ground at these dealerships? Like, will they just pile up and sit there, and then what? The dealer won't be permitted by the government to sell like a Ford F-150 or like a gasoline powered vehicle? Is that what's going to happen?
Precisely. They won't be allowed to sell the internal combustion engines provided they meet that quota. And the quota means that unless 1 in 5 at the end of the year or end of the month, whatever the period of 1 in 5, that will soon be, while 2 in 5 and then 3 in 5. And then by 2035, by the way, we're planning already for 27 models. It's even 25. It means that by 2033, you're going to start to see a lot of sales drop. You're going to see a lot of people, basically running to the repair shops to fix their old internal combustion engines or buying their product in the United States. Whatever the case may be, I'm sure they'll try to find a way to regulate that. At the end of all of this, who the hell's going to pay the fuel taxes to pay for the infrastructure in this country? Who's going to pay the road taxes, the federal excise tax of 10 cents a liter, the provincial tax of 9 cents a liter in my province? It can be as high as 19 cents a liter in Quebec. Look, I think we are living in a delusional world because we simply forgot that it's no longer 2015. It's now 2025. And for that reason, I think people need to give their heads a bit of a shake and demand of Mark Carney that he get rid of these EV mandates in the same way that we had to get rid of carbon taxes because they were extraordinarily detrimental to the economy. This is just another facet of that very dangerous policy agenda called net zero. And it's going to fail both Canadians commercially and financially.
I'm going to get into the finances writ large in a second. I just wanted to finish here on EVs because we drilled down on this, on how much this is just going to cost. Number one, just on the lot, still with the rebates, and imagine the rebates were all still there for what they were giving them for. A Nissan Leaf, which is a very simple sort of a runabout sedan car, not a super fancy car. The electric Nissan Leaf was still about 15 grand more than what a comparable was for an internal combustion engine. If you are in the market and you're a working class family and you want to be able to get a new car, which comes along with a lot of guarantees, right, and maintenance and all that stuff, lots of folks want that, especially if they have to commute, they don't have the extra 15 grand. Like, the price differential for the sticker difference was still big there. And then we start getting into these mandates where I'm just envisioning these business people who are trying to sell vehicles, who are now having to answer to the federal government with a tally at the end of every month. And then what happens to their inventory? Like, this is going to be crazy. And to your point, if I drive across to Montana and go down there and try to buy a normal vehicle and bring it back across the border, they're just going to nail me with some sort of, environmental import tariff or something. It gets pretty wild. I started doing the math because here in Alberta, it sounds strange because we're supposed to be this energy capital, but in the winter, we will literally get like warnings on our phone. Don't use your toaster. Everybody stop using your hairdryer. We're going to have a blackout on the grid. And then I'm sitting there thinking, how is this going to work? I can't make my kids toast in the morning in January, but everybody's supposed to plug in their EVs. It makes no sense. So I sat down and did the math, Dan. Say Santa Claus brought everybody an EV. So all of the ones that we privately own right now that are in our driveways and in our garages that are internal combustion engines, say they magically changed to battery powered. We would need 3 huge can-do nuclear reactors just to power those vehicles. Like, number one, we're not building those. 2, they cost billions and billions of dollars and about 10 years each to build. So the energy is not there. And don't take my word for it. Natural Resources Canada, the federal government, said the transition is going to cost anywhere between $300 and $400 billion.
Just for the province, yeah.
We have unmoney right now, Dan. How on earth are the feds, seriously, how are the adults in the room, in the federal government, expecting Canadians and taxpayers to be able to afford this transition?
creative financing based on flawed science and an ignorance of the realities about the laws of thermodynamics and energy. Look, I always keep this with me. It's my little coin, my commemorative coin from Pickering, Ontario. It's when it was first commissioned back in 1965, which is my old riding. They weren't worried about climate. They were just worried about being able to provide energy to make Ontario a powerhouse to respond to the fact that they didn't have the same hydrology as Quebec. It didn't have the energy that Alberta was starting to show at that time. So we came up with good technology that worked and has worked for the past 60 or 70 years. And so, for me, it's pragmatism has to come back into how we do these things. And someone who tells me that, driving a vehicle is somehow going to cause the weather to change, I suggest they come here to Ontario where it's been really cold. Although next week we get 33-degree weather, I'm sure the climate bedwetters will be out telling us that the world is coming to an end. But at the end of all of this, for a country that's, $1.4 trillion in the hole, which, Canadian Taxpayers Federation has really emphasized, a country that's facing a possibility of having to pay $70 billion of good money just to service that debt, and a possibility that we have a deficit that's much higher than that. We thought $72 billion was a lot. Wait till we see what happens, which is why Mark Carney doesn't want to have a budget. How, in goodness name, can we afford what the Royal Bank of Canada said a few years ago to bring 90% electrification to the country would cost $2 to $3 trillion? We don't have it. My grandfather used to say, I say so politely, look, in Canada, we have got a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of.
That is perfectly said. Okay, I'm just going to hit pause for a second there because I'm desperate for blue pills right now. I've been eating black pills for the last few weeks. Okay, but I'm going to, folks who are listening and watching, you got to hang around for this. Okay,
Yeah.
you have to listen to Dan's analysis of where do we go from here? Is there light at the end of this tunnel? Is Carney truly going to be the adult in the room? I mean, the dude has a PhD in economics from Oxford. He's got to know his way around an abacus. But to do that, you have to subscribe. So head on over to Juno News and become a subscriber and a supporter of the Candice Malcolm Show. And we're going to pick this up in a second.